So, David, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I'm so grateful that you reached out and that we get to have this opportunity to connect and exchange ideas and just hopefully learn from each other.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I think I saw in the one of the Facebook Stoic groups that you were looking for guests, and just I think I saw you had a comment on one of the posts there where I was kind of just commenting, trying to bring sort of some reason and useful information to the Facebook comment sections that can kind of become a lot of you know toxicity and just trolling and things like that.
Oh man, and geez, I'm glad you're mentioning that because I go back and forth. I do use social media to try to promote the practice that I work at in the podcast. But when I join a group, whether it's the Stoicism group or there's many others that I try to connect myself to, I rarely can engage in the comments because they're either just triggering or just infuriating. And I'm like, God, what is the point of this? I know that sounds maybe too negative or
No,
skeptical, but
it's a great test of your stoicism because you'll see people in there talking
oh,
about what stoicism is, and I'm like, I think you've lost your cool. I think they've gotten to you. And I
oh
just like to throw out
man.
little bits. Here's a nice quote. Here's something. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and let me say this too, because this comes up quite a bit, like in the Stoicism group, or again, like as I think you are, I'm very interested in like Jungian psychology, but I'm also very interested in Freud and Lacan and all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff. I kind of see myself as there was this anthropologist, Levi Strauss, who talked about being a bricoleur or someone who kind of creates like a work of art out of various different pieces. And so
Yeah.
I don't find myself easily fitting into any particular group.
Yeah.
And I guess I mention all that to say when I post something on the Stoicism group or when I'm reading the comments, I quickly feel like, man, if I'm not 100% on board, then I can't belong.
Yeah.
And I'm not picking on Stoicism. So many of the groups that I get a part of are like that, and that's just frustrating to me.
Yeah. People arguing, that, excuse me, like they get to decide what defines stoicism. Although it's interesting to look and see, what is it exactly the ancients said? But then modern people, will become, do you need to believe this or do you need to believe that? And it's just, interesting what people take from it. But yeah, that I certainly am a little bit eclectic that I try to really understand what is this traditional stoicism idea. But then I think that it somewhat is like not entirely consistent with Jungian psychology. That's maybe more influenced maybe by Plato and some different things, a lot of different philosophies. But so yeah, a little bit eclectic, but I like to understand what is the difference.
Sure, man. Well said. And I hope that in a moment, as our conversation unfolds, we can get into maybe some of those differences and I'm just interested in kind of highlighting you and your perspective. And like I said, I try to adopt a posture where I really learn from my guest. I mean, this is my kind of collaborative framework in therapy too. Sure, I bring some type of expertise to the process with my clients, but I don't believe I'm the expert in their life. I really try to yeah, learn and grow from them as well.
Yeah, that I like that I saw your practice is really focused on, at least the way I define it, like mature masculinity, right? What is it to be a secure man, a healthy man, right? Things like that. Really something needed
Yeah.
in our society. It's not quite my focus of my practice, but when I saw that you were also practicing psychotherapist, that's why I knew I had to reach out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, man. Like when you reached out and I realized, oh shit. By the way, I curse quite a bit, and so please feel free to speak
No
however
problem.
you speak. Um, when I saw that not only are you a male psychotherapist, which can kind of be rare, at least in the United States, we're at least down here in Houston, in Texas, but you also are interested in Stoicism and Jungian psychology. I don't see those two worlds intersecting very often. I got excited. I was like, oh yeah, I've got to
Yeah.
connect with this guy and see what he's about and see if I can learn something from him.
Especially younger male psychotherapists, right? I really don't meet many, even just locally, right? It's, yeah, maybe 1 in 20 sometimes with a therapist I know, right? It's
Yeah,
not,
although man, I
yeah.
will say so this couple days ago was my 37th birthday. So I guess that's
Yeah.
still technically young, but I feel kind of old. I've got
Yeah.
four kids. I can no
Yeah.
longer say I'm in my 30s. I have to say I'm in my late 30s.
Yep. Yep. I'm the same. I'm in the same place now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a really specific question about Stoicism that I'd want us to maybe jump into. But before that, can you just tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself, kind of what you do, maybe what you emphasize in, some of your interests, maybe a little bit about your podcast, and then we can
Yeah.
kind of go from there if that works for you, David.
Yeah, so to try to summarize it, and some of my interests are all over, but I do see a common theme how it all comes together, which is basically around this question of finding meaning. And so I'm
Mm,
a therapist, I especially practice from dialectical behavior therapy approach, which is very skills based, but also then deals with some of the most difficult problems of suicidal ideation, feeling hopeless, worthless, self-harm, substance abuse, all of that.
yeah, so I
And
actually had a question for you about that.
yeah,
So I've heard of DBT and
yeah,
utilize some of the concepts, but it was my understanding that it was primarily like a group-based approach.
yeah.
Is that right, or am I getting that
That
wrong?
is that is a full DBT program, and actually, it's a thing with my practice. It's a group I'm with that we're starting more of those groups. The DBT groups. But when I first learned it, it would be a thing where a supervisor would say, "Hey, here's some DBT handouts. Go teach some people DBT skills, right?" And you don't really have a lot of preparation. You're like, "Well, I'm smart enough to figure out this handout, and then I can share it with some people."
Sure.
But as I did some real trainings and working towards getting certified in DBT, there's the full program, which is about the skills. So you have a group to learn the skills. It's like a class. You then see an individual therapist as well that's helping you really put it into practice in your life, be consistent with it. There's also coaching calls if it is that severe as like suicidal thoughts and self-harm. So that's the full kind of system. But as I learned it, I really used it a lot in my individual practice. So just it was really kind of a way to know you're hitting everything, right? When you're working with a client, it's one thing to do CBT to kind of change your thoughts, to change your emotions, but to have a group of what are, coping skills when you feel overwhelmed. How do you understand your emotions? What are all the different emotions you could feel, and how do you learn about those?
Right.
How do you deal then with like trying to interact with other people and dealing with difficult people in your life, and that there's some skills for that too, right? So I kind of once I learned that, it was a really helpful way, especially as a young therapist. Like, oh, I don't know everything, but I know here's the handbook, and there's something in here that's going to help. And
Sure,
yeah,
sure. I don't know how much like popular culture you access, but even though some people would say the show was like shit and they didn't like it. I have two sons who really wanted me to watch She-Hulk on
oh
Disney
yeah,
Plus, Marvel, and it's interesting that I think in the first episode they actually mentioned DBT. And like Bruce Banner, the Hulk, actually sits down and teaches her. Like he doesn't say this, but he basically is teaching her wise mind.
yeah, yeah.
And I just thought, damn, how interesting that it's bled into even the most popular streams of like popular
No,
culture.
I need to go watch that now. And I think there was like an interview with Lady Gaga or something like that where she talked about. So I don't know. It was one of the
Where
pop
where she,
singers.
where she mentions DBT as well.
Her experience going through it.
Oh
Yeah, I
wow.
actually can't say if it was Lady Gaga or some other pop singer though. But yeah,
Okay.
that it's kind of getting out there, that is based on basically CBT combined with some Buddhist philosophy and mindfulness practices. And this, how do you accept the hardest things in life, right? How do you accept really painful emotions?
Mm,
And that it really overlaps a lot with Stoicism. So to kind of go back to my other interests,
yeah.
that was therapist practicing with DBT, but then as I worked with clients, there's these things that come up where there's not really an answer to issues that are going on with their life, right? That sometimes I'd have the therapy skills, the therapy answers, but other times it would really leave me wondering, right? Especially through the COVID pandemic, that really led me listening to a lot of Stoicism, trying to just felt like everybody was in despair, right? So I wanted to listen to somebody that was not despairing about the
Sure.
situation. And that was a bunch of these different Stoicism podcasters I started listening to. Um,
Yeah.
and
Do you mind
yeah,
if I pause you just real quick?
no,
Just an
go ahead.
interesting anecdote.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure someone will fact check this, but
yeah,
a couple years ago when I bought the Meditations
yeah,
at Barnes and Noble, I think the man at the desk that was checking me out said, did you know that in 2020 this was the most sold book in our
yeah.
bookstores?
Oh yeah,
And it was interesting. Like he went off on why that was the case, and he got into
yeah.
Stoic philosophy. I thought it was awesome. I was like,
Oh
dude,
yeah.
way to go! Yeah, I could totally see that.
It's a really good book to read, and or it's a really interesting book to read. But there's another really great book. It's called The Inner Citadel by Pierre Hadot,
I
where
love that book.
because he explains what the meditations is about. And I feel like actually that's in some ways more helpful for me to read that,
Mm,
because then you know how to make sense of the meditations, because otherwise you read it and it's very poetic and it's hard to wrap your mind around. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I find it's interesting. Maybe this is too much information, but I have one copy of the meditations like right next to my toilet. And
Yeah.
you know, when I'm dropping a deuce in the mornings and getting ready, like I'll just read a couple little segments.
Yeah. You got to
It's
find a space where it's quiet and people will leave you alone and you can sit. I used to do it. I'd sit in my car and I'd park there at work before I'd go into the building, right? But yeah, if you need to find somewhere, get people to leave you alone, go in the restroom.
Exactly, man.
Yeah.
That's my meditative space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
But
so I'm sorry. I kind of
no,
derailed us. You were talking about your interest in Stoicism. So please continue.
starting with Stoicism and somewhere in there too, it's basically this idea, like looking for answers when, everybody's looking to me for answers. And so, one was the Stoic philosophy. And there was some other book, actually, if I were to say where it really started, I think my mom was looking for like a book recommendation. I was like, oh, here's one called Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. That
Oh,
was the other
James
thing that really,
Hollis.
yeah, that was the other thing that really brought me to studying more philosophy to kind of supplement my therapy practice, this idea of finding meaning. So I was probably talking to my mom about, what I'm doing with very, protecting confidentiality, of course, but just broadly saying, what is it I'm doing in work, helping
Yeah.
people find meaning, right? That's where I'm looking for answers in philosophy.
So
And
David, again, I'm
yeah,
sorry. Can I
no, go
pause you
ahead.
again? I'm like doing
Yeah,
the things that I usually don't, but I'm just really excited about connecting with you.
yeah,
Um, I probably hand out that book to some of
yeah,
my older male clients than any other book.
yeah,
And then the other piece with James Hollis, I've never met him. I don't know him, but my
yeah,
psychotherapist that I went to for many years, who wasn't a Jungian analyst, but he was the director of something called the Jung Center in Houston.
yeah,
He would say he's a Jungian trained psychotherapist, a PhD in
yeah,
Jungian psychology. He was mentored by James Hollis. James Hollis was the previous director of this Houston Jung Center. So
yeah.
he had me
So he's from
read like
Houston.
pretty
Yeah,
much all of his books. Yeah. I don't know that he's originally from Houston, but I think he's in New York now. His last post was the director of the Jung Center in Houston. And so
yeah,
his thought like permeated my entire like kind of therapeutic journey. So
yeah.
I love Hollis.
Yeah, and it's something about me that I read that and then I'm like, I need to know more. And then I start really diving into all these different things to understand Jung's theory. And I think you really don't start with reading Jung. It goes back, as you said, right? He's, like a PhD trained in Jungian psychology. You're still not an
Right.
analyst because there's such an involved process to
There
really
really
go
is.
through that. Yeah. One way to say it's an initiation, right? You have to get initiated into this whole process to then become a leader, right? And or a ritual leader. People are looking to you for guidance, right? And on spiritual
Absolutely.
topics and all of that. But I think it was Hollis was what got me started. And I'm really enjoying that all these books and you've like books I like to talk to people about and they usually haven't heard of. Um, and as I read a little bit about Jung and how I make sense of this, Jungian archetypes and these theories, something I read, probably a quote of Jung and somebody else, that you have to understand the mythology. I think it was Hollis who
Mm.
said you need a mature spirituality. And I'm like, well, I don't know what that is. I don't think I have one. So this is something I need to explore further. And I loved Greek mythology when I was a kid. My dad would read it to me. And just as I'm reading about different myths and different things again, it was my friend who I co-host the podcast with, Between Two Ravens, Norse mythology podcast. He was talking about all this stuff with history. That it was kind of his way of, I think, coping with the pandemic was just studying and reading history, just learning stuff for his own, self-interest,
Sure.
things he wanted to learn. And he was seeing these family trees where the ancient kings were saying they descended from Odin or they descended from Adam and Eve. And he's like, do they really believe this? Like, what's going on here that they say they're related to Odin? And I'm like, that's an interesting question, Sean. And we sat down and kind of talking about it. And that was our first podcast episode. And then we started going through myths and it just went from there. Yeah.
Dude, that's awesome. I work with quite a few teenage boys and young adult males who
Yeah.
play a lot of video games.
Yeah.
And even though I'm not necessarily a video game player, I know from them and actually from my stepson that, Norse mythology is kind of popular right now with like,
Yeah.
what is it, God of
Yeah.
War? And I think there's an
Yeah.
Assassin's Creed that's connected
Right.
to
Yeah.
Norse
Valhalla or
mythology.
Ragnarok and these things. Yeah.
Exactly. And then I guess with the whole Marvel universe, they
Yeah.
kind of pick on some of that. So
Yeah.
I thought, wow, that's quite relevant to do something on Norse mythology. Not that that was
Yeah.
the guiding kind of impetus, but I thought it was cool that it kind
Right.
of touches on a cultural moment that we're going through.
And as we came together, we're like, yeah, this has got to be again. Yeah, it started. We're like, I don't even know if there's going to be 10 people listening to us, and then within a year, it's like 50,000 downloads, 50
Dude, that's
episodes, things like
incredible.
that, just kind
Yeah.
of taking off. and that we really get into the nerdy details of like what was the original source for all of this. That
Mm.
there's these old documents, they call them the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, that were written around the year 1000, and that's our kind of connection. That's the only way we know anything about what was happening in the Nordic countries and their mythology and spirituality and things back then. So
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that it kind of reminds me around the Protestant Reformation, they would have a phrase ad fontes, which was back to the sources.
yeah,
We got to go
yeah,
back and read
yeah.
like, yeah, the original text and not just what the tradition has said. Not that the tradition isn't important, but I love that idea of kind of going back and reading the primary sources.
It's sort of some of these values to think for yourself, right? To really try to make sense of it yourself, and that's it's a value I appreciate, and I think for clients it's a good idea. Yeah,
Oh, that's well said. And in my understanding, I don't know that Jung really reflected very much on Norse mythology. So I thought that was cool that you're somebody who's interested in his
yeah.
thought and then Norse mythology. I thought that was cool.
A little bit here or there they talk about Odin and kind of connecting him to Mercury as the Greek gods, but there wasn't a lot of things written to understand the Norse mythology well back then. So it was,
Got you.
and the interesting thing is that I recently wrote a blog post about this idea that it's a very unrefined mythology. That for the Greeks
Mm,
and Romans, they had a lot of philosophers and professional writers who were educated, really thinking, and they kept rewriting and rewriting and revising. What are these gods? What are these archetypes? But the Nordic ones are much more what just popped up from these poets that walked town to town. They'd go to kind of the local king and tell him some poems and tell him some stories as their entertainment, and it just came up very organically. And they're very much like more of these dark figures.
mm,
Although Greek mythology, there's a lot. Zeus is, cheating on his wife, getting everybody pregnant, things like that too.
sure.
But that Odin's not a guy you look up to necessarily. That he can't handle, you know, he's a god, but he's not quite all powerful. And that he's going to die, or his son is going to die, and he can't accept that, and he's fighting
Mm,
it, and he goes to the underworld, and there's all these things that he sort of does he lead to his own self-destruction in some ways and things like that. So it's very, and then as I learned the Jungian stuff of, how do you interpret that myth like a dream kind of, right? And how do you maybe relate to things in that? All of that.
yeah. Oh, that's good, David. Okay, can I ask you this just to kind of maybe go back a few steps? I
Yeah.
sometimes like to ask my guests to maybe describe their childhood a little bit. And what I mean by that is, were there any religious sources or philosophical or spiritual or I don't know any other thing that would have kind of constructed a framework for you to make sense of the world early on that you either still embrace or maybe you've like let go of? I'm just
Yeah.
curious where people come from.
It is interesting. I think I've talked a little bit about it on the podcasts or blog posts, but that, so I grew up Christian. My dad was very religious. We went to church every week,
What
and
tradition do you remember?
Methodist. Yeah,
Methodist.
Methodist.
Okay.
And I think we were Presbyterian at one before we moved, kind of, and then we moved and it was Methodist. And I really enjoyed the church. I enjoyed the people there, the community. I saw a lot of the values or the strengths in it. But if I'm really honest with myself now, as I'm an adult, I never believed in any of it. Right? I was very much a scientist. I liked science. I was determined I was going to be a scientist when I grew up. And so I was like,
Sure.
I don't get what all these people are doing, but they're very nice people, so I'll go along with it, kind of. And that's the thing now is I'm really, as I work with my clients, right, on knowing yourself and trusting yourself and not, just telling other people what they want to hear, what that does to your self-esteem and your self-worth. Um, that so that's that idea is, I've come back to what's mature spirituality. It's not the
Mm,
spirituality where you just believe what they tell you and you believe it to get along with everyone and don't upset anybody, but actually to really ask the questions for yourself. And when someone gives you an answer that doesn't satisfy you, where do you go and try to find the next answer and things like that?
yeah, man, that actually dovetails with sort of my healing journey. I didn't grow up religious, but my parents were very kind of intellectual. We read a lot.
Yeah,
Kind of in my 20s had sort of like a religious conversion and I now
yeah,
understand it being motivated probably by some trauma and some other psychological issues,
yeah,
but it was all about an external authority that I was clinging to give me a sense of
yeah.
stability and a sense of self. Part of what was so healing about doing psychotherapy with kind of a Jungian was beginning to, I know you've talked about a mature spirituality. I guess the way we talked about it was beginning to learn to trust my inner authority,
Yeah. Yeah.
not that there's not any place for external authorities, but I think in line with what you were talking about, it's so crucial that we align ourselves with kind of that inner compass, that self,
Yeah.
that's kind of this guiding psychological force.
The some of the concepts, again, I'm not an expert on it, right? But as I try to understand them, a term called the ego self axis. I think it's a
Yeah.
book by Edinger that I'm planning to read. I have it on my bedside.
Oh,
But that
man, that's one of my favorites. It's a great one.
yeah. So that's why I was reading and listening to Robert Moore talk about it, and I was like, I gotta read this. But at least, yeah, kind of my understanding of it, right, is that he's saying that that inner authority, right, is sort of like your soul. And what is the soul, right? It's separate from your ego, but then maybe it's the way you get to see what is actually then a higher authority. That you need something that's greater than you, that's outside of you, to um, it's not all just you, right? You're not the source of it, yet trusting your connection and not somebody else's, right? Is sort of, I think,
Yeah,
important. Yeah,
absolutely. You
yeah.
know, have you ever accessed the work of one of Jung's students, James Hillman?
Hillman, yeah, that he's archetypal psychology, right?
Yes. So
Yeah,
he was maybe considered Jung's greatest student in some ways,
yeah,
American. But not to get too deep into him, but I think you would resonate with him because he does a
yeah,
lot of work with like myths and he kind of takes, some have called him kind of a postmodern Jung, in that
yeah,
he kind of took some of his central concepts, and while he liked where Jung was going, he kind of pushed it even further to
yeah,
say, you know, maybe Jung was a little bit too rigid in the concepts. Can we expand this a little bit more? And where he would say Jung was still governed by kind of a monotheistic Christian kind of
yeah,
worldview in some ways, he argued for kind of a polytheistic approach to
yeah.
reality. Not literally polytheistic, but in terms of like the archetypes and the images. So that might be somebody for you to check out. I think you'd
That's
resonate with him.
you're the second person to tell me that I sound like him or something of that nature. So yeah,
No, yeah. As you speak, I'm thinking, man, he's gonna really connect with Hillman.
yeah. It's interesting too because as much as Jung was, I was just reading his Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Right.
Yeah,
So as much as he was a Christian, he was very much more of that Gnostic Christian type, which is there's the father and the mother. Right. There's sort of a little more than just one God, but it's all the way I like to see it, the facets of the unity. So whether you see God as a unity or all these pantheon gods, it's just the angle or the level you're looking at it. Yeah.
oh yeah. And then I don't know if you ever read his I think it's one of his latest books, and he, in the preface, he talks about struggling to publish it because it's so personal, but he felt like he had to. God's
Yeah.
Answer to Job.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. I think most kind of Orthodox Christians would have a shit fit reading that
Yeah.
because of some of the radical things he says about the God image, and
Yeah.
how God needs humanity to kind of become conscious. There's some really radical ideas in there.
It's interesting because I think there's a lot of people and also Christians who I think it kind of fits with their internal sense of things, but it does not fit the dogma or the orthodoxy, right?
It's so
And
true.
it's funny when Jung is talking, and I feel like he's really talking about the Stoic God, although he really doesn't talk much about Stoicism. But because the
Mm,
Stoic God is the idea, it is just the universe. It is the sort of they say the logos or the reason that orders nature to be what it is.
sure,
Um, and that yeah, that we're the eyes that are conscious of it, right? That's what humans are. So that really
sure.
fits with that, like that God needs us. But then that sounds offensive to typical Christians. Yeah,
Yeah, well, and even the idea, this is getting into some Hegel and stuff. Even the idea that God changes and he doesn't know everything, he's not perfect. I mean, Jung talked about, with his idea of the quaternity, right? There's even evil embedded within the Godhead, and that would be anathema. That would be
yeah,
absolute heresy in kind of Orthodox Christianity. But I find it to be quite powerful and liberating.
yeah. And that's the kind of stuff I do. So I was mentioning what the Stoicism and kind of the podcast living to as well as the walled garden. So it's the walled garden philosophical society.
Okay, I was hoping you could say more about that. I think I
Yeah,
was listening to Simon Drew when it was
yeah.
maybe called something else, like the
The
Practical
practical
Stoic.
stoic.
Okay,
Yep.
and
Right.
man, he had some awesome people on there. I love
Yeah.
his accent too.
Yep. Yep. And then so
So,
he's in the U.S. now. He's in California, and
oh, okay,
that and he's kind of expanding it. Including still kind of that Stoicism is the root of it, but looking at a lot of other philosophies and how they all inform each other. Um,
sure.
I forget what was my but this question of kind of philosophically studying the divine or
Mm,
sort of like theology, but not from any one religious perspective. It's
sure.
what do all the different philosophies say, right? So that, as you're saying, is God just good, or does God have four parts and one of them is not good?
Right.
These are just theories, right? As a scientist, you're just like, well, that's one theory, that's your theory. Let's see how they work out when we apply them.
Right.
But so that's, as you asked about how my childhood shaped stuff, right? That having both, being exposed to all the religious ideas, also mythological ideas, but also kind of very much science. I think I always tried to reconcile them as much as they don't easily reconcile. Yeah.
Got you. Okay, so maybe we can begin to explore this one. So this is a big question. I definitely don't have the answer. I think it may be a bit of a paradox, or in my understanding, this is where, Stoicism, and I'm going to call it a depth psychology approach, because I think
Yeah.
within that, I would want to include Hillman and Jung, and maybe even like somebody like Freud and Lacan, where they're going to want to say, hey, the unconscious
Yeah.
is maybe the most fundamental reality. It's something
Right.
that is constitutive of what it means to be human. I don't know that there's an understanding of the unconscious in Stoicism.
No.
How do we make, I mean, how do you hold that kind of tension together?
Yeah. That I'm exploring it and trying to make sense of it. And as I talk to the people who really are into this traditional Stoicism, whether they, and sometimes they really believe it. For myself, I'm not sure it's like my full, personal philosophy of life, but I
Sure.
want to know what it is to know how much I agree with it. That it is all about the physical world, but it would say that kind of that God and all of these ideas, they're embedded within that. So it's the kind of the metaphor I like to use is like the difference between particles and waves for light, right? That is light a particle or is it a wave? And it depends. When we look at it different ways, we see it different ways. So that idea of the logos, right? The reason of God, that it then it's like a wave, but then as it shows up as the particles, the manifest physical world. Um, and one of the things Marcus Aurelius will say is that, and it's also Chris Fisher, who does Stoicism on Fire. He talks a lot about
Okay.
traditional Stoicism.
Okay.
Uh,
I'm
he,
not familiar. I'll have to check him out.
yeah, because he really talks, really wants to understand what were the original, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, what were they really believing? He uses a quote called providence or atoms. It's this idea, what is the
Mm,
universe? Is it providence? And that has a very significant Christian meaning, but then also
right.
what's the Stoic meaning? Or is everything just matter? They're just these little atoms flying around and it just happened they all ran into each other the way they did?
And I
Or
think that
was
would be
there,
the Epicurean perspective.
yeah, and that's, I think, when Marcus Aurelius talks about it, he's contrasting Stoic versus Epicurean. Yeah, is it something that's meaningful or just atoms? And
Hmm.
that, so to relate it to the unconscious, that there's something about that wave perspective that I think is like the things in the background that we can't see.
Mm.
Or are they really all just like variables? They're just our, in our human mind as we try to make sense of things and put them in categories and boxes, and it doesn't exist anywhere else other than, um, yeah, floating in our
Sure,
mind,
sure.
right?
Well, let me throw this out, David, to see what you think.
Yeah,
And again, I always want to be careful because I see myself as kind of eclectic, this bricoleur. I
yeah,
can fall into, because language does this to us, and
yeah,
just trying to construct arguments. I think it's easy to build straw men. I don't want to do that. So
yeah,
if it comes across like I'm too easily setting something up to then tear it down, please stop me and say no, that's not
mm,
correct. But one of the ways that to me the whole unconscious versus is there an unconscious kind of debate fleshes out practically is I kind of see stoicism as really privileging, that faculty within us, reason that can kind of
yeah,
make sense of things, that can
yeah,
provide some insight so that maybe we can act in accord with nature, act in light of the virtues, which makes a lot of sense. But then there's kind of the whole depth psychology approach, which says, wait, I think Hollis even has a quote where he says, the ego is a thin wafer in the midst of a giant like unconscious sea.
yeah,
That it seems to me the emphasis on this other side is, I mean, we may have moments of insight and reason, but much of our existence, much of life is kind of this unconscious process. And depending on which day I wake up, I kind of resonate with one side versus the
yeah.
other. And so I'm
So
torn for sure.
yeah, as you're saying, is it a straw man thing or not? I think it's really not. That the
Okay.
Stoics really don't agree with this. What would be kind of the Plato's view, because I think what Freud gets, his idea of the unconscious and the id, the sort of three levels of the soul, id, ego, superego, that's very much Plato. What's interesting is, so the Stoics learned about Socrates from Xenophon. The two authors who wrote about Socrates were Plato and Xenophon, and that's how Zeno, who started the Stoicism, learned about. And that was actually a military general who studied under Socrates and wrote kind of notes and things about him. It's a very different perspective how they got
Mm,
kind of informed by it. Um, and so that it is different. And it goes to that question, right? What is human nature? Is there a kind of human, very animal nature, this anger and passions that we need to control?
right.
Or is that just people being a little confused? I think that's where it goes when you're confused. But as long as you really understood your real unconscious, everything would be rational, ordered, good, virtue, things like that.
Sure, sure. So this is interesting. So I actually, one of my graduate degrees is like in religious studies and theology. And I
Yeah.
remember kind of, I wasn't into Stoicism yet, but we read about Stoicism, but from like the ancient Christian perspective. And
Yeah.
one of the ways, and I'm not saying I agree with the Christian perspective, but see if I can set this up. They would critique the Stoics for, I mean, in their words, not having a robust enough view of like human frailty or sin. Like it was like their reason was just maybe a little bit off, and we could work on making it kind of correct, and then we could
Yeah.
understand the world. Where Christians would argue that even the mind, reason has been corrupted, and that you need kind of this supernatural grace to kind of restore it. And even then, as the Apostle Paul would say, we just see through a glass darkly.
Yeah.
um, we can't really recover, full reason. It's just an interesting point, I think.
Yeah. That it makes me think how the question, like, are all religions, they're kind of all looking at the same thing, that maybe all
Mm,
religions, there's something very compatible about them, or that maybe there are some real significant differences, and maybe that's okay. Um,
yeah,
there's parts that can't agree, but then parts that really do agree. And I think it goes back to the pagan aspect of the Stoics, and it's actually similar to what I see showing up in the Norse about the idea of fate, right? That fate is what it is, and it's that there's a
mm,
providence, but it doesn't necessarily actually care about us. It cares about the grand scheme of things, and if you kind of get crushed under the wheel, and that was part of the bigger plan, it's when people say, like, that everything happens for a reason, right?
right.
It's not necessarily that happens for a good reason, but it happens due to reason, right? That there's a logic
Mm,
and a sense, and it happened because this other thing happened before, and it goes in order.
that's
But
powerful. Yeah.
yeah, that there's a and I think I just made that up previously when I thought of thinking about it, but
Yeah. Hey, you
yeah,
need to write that down. That's some good
I know,
shit,
right?
man.
Yeah, make it up, put it on a t-shirt or a meme or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But because a lot of people are very hurt by that when they're, either Christian or formerly Christians,
Of
that everything
course.
happens for a reason. Well, then why did this awful thing happen? And I can't see a reason in it, right? And it's not a good reason. It's not something you're going to like. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so would you say that when it comes to maybe a stoic approach to the universe, even to I don't know that they believed in God. I mean, I know they talked about the logos, and that
Yeah.
there was a type of divinity maybe in their theology, but that this being or this force, whatever it is, this underlying principle of reason doesn't really care about humans in the way that maybe the Judaic or
Right.
Islamic or Christian God does.
Yeah. I think that's accurate. Although it's interesting because I think it was, best my understanding from reading Hollis and A.A. Long and some others, that it's the idea is that God is good and that God is the universe. They're the
Mm,
same thing, right? So that idea from Christianity that God is everywhere. It's like, well, the Stoics agree with that, but then
mm,
the reason Christianity doesn't agree with pantheism is that, well, it's not, God's not just that. It's not just that God is the universe. God's also the creator. And that's sort of that second. Is there a thing in the background here that came before, or is it just the the reality, right?
yeah.
And then that God is good, and it's, for everything, that why we have the world we have, and we have all the wonderful things we have, but that we might want things to be even better. Well, that's not part of the plan, right? That it's, you know if you align yourself with that, things will go well. Things will go kind of the way they're supposed to.
Right.
If you're fighting it, maybe things get worse. So that idea of to not resist your fate, to not fight against nature or your nature, is it's also that question of, do we have free will, or is it all predetermined? And that it's
Sure.
the Stoics is called a soft determinism. It's kind of both, but it's mostly determined. But there's a little room for you to choose something.
Yeah. No, right. I think I can't remember which one of the Stoics uses the analogy of the dog and the cart.
Yeah, yeah. I share that with my clients occasionally. And again, one of my little additions I've made onto it, right, is because it's the metaphor is that fate is a cart being pulled by horses, and you're a dog tied to the cart, so that you can choose to run along with the cart, and you'll keep going with it, and kind of have to keep going. If you stop, you're going to get dragged by it. And then the idea that bring that metaphor to yourself personally. If you are the dog being dragged by the cart, how do you get back on your feet? Right, that is incredibly hard. And maybe
Mm.
now you see the whole picture and you want to, but the cart's not going to stop for you. So that's such a harder effort to overcome than just keep running with the cart, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's good. No, I kind of explore that metaphor with a few of my clients as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that
So
is. It's easy to say keep running with the cart, but it's, well, what if you already stopped? Yeah, how do you get back up? That
yeah,
is
no, well
that is
said.
to appreciate how big that is, how hard that is. Yeah,
Yes, yes. So David, okay, would you be okay if there's a couple quotes that I want to read from this article that Donald Robertson wrote,
yeah,
where he's, I think, in some ways trying to address why Stoicism as a philosophy is not synonymous with, let's say, like a toxic or unhealthy masculinity.
yeah.
And there's just a couple things from him and then from Marcus Aurelius in his meditations that I just kind of want to have a dialogue about, if you're okay with that.
No, let's look at it. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So let me open my notes. So the article, and I'll post, by the way, I'll post all your information and your podcast in the show notes. But this article is Donald Robertson, who's I think he's a CBT psychotherapist and author, Stoic
I'm pretty sure
philosopher.
he's the book. Yeah, the I forget the title right now too, but basically he really, yeah, breaks down how CBT is Stoicism to a
Yeah,
large extent and comes from it, and that's a
yeah.
topic I enjoy. Yeah,
Yeah, that was actually a really good book. So the article is entitled, you can find it on Medium. It's The Greatest Stoic Argued That Kindness is More Manly Than Anger. And okay, so I'm going to read a passage from the Meditations, and then maybe we can just kind of break it down. So Marcus writes, and I guess it's important to say, I know you'll know this, but maybe some of my listeners won't, that it's at some level, this was like a private journal.
yeah,
Marcus did not intend this to be published. And so I think it's important to highlight that with this paragraph, because he's not really, standing on a podium and, like, you can almost think of like a preacher, like moralistically preaching to a crowd. He's sort of exhorting himself.
yeah,
And so it's kind of a statement to himself. So he says, when you do become angry, be ready to apply this thought, that to fly into a passion is not a sign of manliness, but rather to be kind and gentle. For insofar as these qualities are more human, they are also more manly. It is the man who possesses such virtues who has strength, nerve, and fortitude, and not one who is ill humored and discontented. Indeed, the nearer a man comes in his mind to freedom from unhealthy passions or apathei, the nearer he comes to strength. Just as grief is a mark of weakness, so is anger too, for those who yield to either have been wounded and have surrendered to the enemy. I know there's a lot there,
oh yeah,
but I guess I'll set it up by saying, and I did a episode with my wife a few weeks ago. We were discussing the book Tuesdays with Maury, and so this kind of came up too. That for Marcus, and this is Donald Robertson's idea, he was kind of addressing what would have been considered kind of a toxic masculinity of his day. So he was
yeah,
aware of these constructions of masculinity that maybe weren't
yeah,
that healthy. So I'll say that. The other thing I'll say is, this is from Robertson, one of Marcus's political adversaries, who was like uprising in the Civil War, would call him publicly a philosophical old woman.
yeah.
Which I mean, I'm going to say it right. I'm not endorsing this word, but he was basically calling him a pussy.
Yeah, I mean that idea, right? Back then, to be a Stoic was to be a philosophical old woman, and now to be a Stoic is be like, oh, you're a man and you don't have feelings, right? And two very different pictures of
Exactly.
Stoicism.
Isn't that
Yeah,
no, no, isn't that crazy? Okay, so
yeah.
I was hoping that would kind of like stir you up a little bit and get you talking about, in light of what I just read, how is Stoicism not synonymous with what in our culture at least gets framed as kind of an unhealthy masculinity?
That quote really does speak to, yeah, as a Stoic, what's the proper relationship to your own emotions? Because that
Mm,
is a tricky question. A lot of Stoicism does sound like do away with those emotions, be rational.
right.
And that can easily be taken to some, yeah, modern toxic masculinity places, right? Just repress your emotions, don't have them. If anybody else has emotions, they're weak, don't have those emotions. He even says in there, right, something about that grief is a weakness, right?
I was
Um,
hoping we would maybe kind of
yeah,
nuance what you think he means by that, because yeah, I still read that phrase and I cringe a little bit,
yeah.
even though I think I can have a charitable understanding of what he was actually saying.
It goes back, right? That this is me bringing in some of the DBT, right? That there's a
Please.
judgment that weakness is bad, right? That because to have the way I would rephrase it, right, is to have a moment of weakness, right? When you're in your grief and you have a moment of weakness, and then you actually listen to your emotion and you do, what does grief tell you to do, right? Is it to cry? Is it to isolate? Is it to take some time for yourself, right? That's a moment of weakness. That the main thing about Stoicism, it's not to not feel your feelings, but it is all about don't act on them. Don't be controlled by your feelings. Don't let them decide how you act. You decide how you act. And this is how I bring in the DBT and, as you said, wise mind and your emotion mind and your reasonable mind.
Sure.
That the wise mind is the place in between the two, so that you notice your emotion. If you're not noticing your emotion, you're too far on reasonable mind. You're saying, well, just be reasonable, right? Just be logical. Don't feel. Which is probably a piece of toxic masculinity, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea that, that weakness, right, is weakness only a bad thing? It was Juan Perez who does I think he does the Spanish language practical Stoic in Spanish. But he did a presentation for Walled Garden on courageous vulnerability, talking about Marcus Aurelius, how actually to
Mm,
be vulnerable, that's very hard. That's very scary. So when you're refusing to show your vulnerabilities, you're refusing to admit you have any emotions, that's because you're scared. You're scared of your emotions. So that actually to be courageous is to overcome that's to
mm,
be manly, right? So it's
yeah.
really, and this goes back to actually being conscious of yourself, right? To admit that there's a fear there, and maybe there's layers of fear, rather than pretending none of it's there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, I for a lot of reasons I have this book, Tuesdays with Maury. I don't know if you've ever read that.
No, I've heard a lot about it, but
Okay, okay. It's a great book. I had that in my kind of mind, in my imagination, just having read it and talked about it. But one of the things that he says, so the conceit of the book is that this kind of old professor is dying. He's been diagnosed with ALS. He has a couple months left, and an old student visits him every Tuesday to kind of learn about the meaning of life and
yeah,
emotions and death and all that kind of stuff. And at one point, the student Mitch asks, his teacher, like, be honest, like, how are you really doing? Like, doesn't this suck? And he says, honestly, I hate it. Uh, there's very few mornings where I don't begin by just like bawling my eyes out.
yeah,
But then I kind of look at myself in the mirror and I don't deny or repress what's happening, but I kind of try to focus on the good that I still have left. I try to focus on my relationships and so it's capturing this nuance of, yes, there's a place for grief and being honest with our situation, but I think there's also a place to focus on gratitude and,
yeah.
yeah, being in the moment and some of the stuff that I think Stoicism would promote.
Yeah, because to be in that moment of grief and to face it bravely, and then what does that actually entail? But part of that would be allow all that the feelings, right? To actually approach what does it feel like looking back at all of my life that now I'm not going to have anymore, right? I
Sure.
already don't have it, right? It's already in the past, but still, right? And all the people that I care about, and now I'll be separated from them, and that you can approach those and sit with them. That's actually the brave thing to do. That from the Stoic view, right? The grief or the avoidance comes from not recognizing the truth that you're mortal and you're going to die, right?
Mm,
That's always was there, and that some part of you was telling yourself you weren't going to die, and now that's why you're upset.
mm.
If you always saw this, you'd keep approaching it and be able to sit with it, even though as hard as it is, right? It's not to say that it's not painful or you'd feel nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really good. You know, I think another thing maybe worth exploring in light of this is have and I'm kind of taking this from I think it's John Sellers who's written this awesome book on Marcus and Donald Robertson's work, just kind of breaking down, you know, even some of the Greek around how they thought about emotions. That because I think for the person who doesn't know much about
Yeah,
Stoicism and they just think it's toxic masculinity,
right.
I think they end up thinking that Stoicism is anti-emotion, and that's actually
Yeah,
incorrect,
yeah.
right?
That they, certain types of the emotions are, I think you use one of the Greek words, sort of pathe, which is like pathological, right? That they're not, but that goes through, there's some emotions that are pathological, right? So I think that's to clarify those. And I can't remember the word they use in Greek, but it's basically the first impressions, that there'll be an
Yeah,
emotion that comes up that's just,
propathei.
yeah, yeah. That's the first, your first reaction that comes up. And that happens for everybody. That's,
And that is
yeah,
maybe I would say that's kind of subconscious or out of our control. I mean, at
yeah,
some level, we can't control parts of our nervous system. You
right.
know, even one of the Stoics talked about in the midst of a storm, right?
Yeah,
One of their esteemed leaders just broke down into tears, and he wasn't criticized for that because that was that moment of like that propathei.
yeah, yeah,
His body took over. You know, I was talking to a client the other day, as manly as you want to be, if there was a rattlesnake that just popped up in front of you,
yeah,
you know, like your nervous system would freak out,
yeah,
regardless of how strong or manly you think you are,
right.
right? Now, what
And
you
that's,
do with that is maybe a different question, but
yeah,
you're going to be struck by that emotion.
right. And that would be right. Do you never go hiking again because you saw a rattlesnake that one time? That would maybe be the
Great
pathic, right?
point.
A
Great point.
not healthy emotion. But that you get to choose, right? And maybe you go somewhere a little bit different. Maybe there's something you do to be a little safer about rattlesnakes next time, right? But that's the difference. And I think it goes back, right? That sometimes we don't have enough words for these things in our language. That's why it is useful to learn a little bit of the Greek, right? That's, a word like
Absolutely.
love, right? How many different ways can you define love, right? So when you hear someone talking about that, you have no idea what they're talking about because you don't know how they define it. Same with the word
Absolutely.
God, right? You don't know how they define
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
So here's one for you. I don't know if you've experienced this in a therapeutic setting. Believe it or not, I have, and very recently. It's one of the reasons I was really excited about talking to you. But since you are more in touch with like the world of Stoicism and maybe have talked to quite a few people, I'm curious if you've heard this complaint. I can't tell you how many guys, these are, you know, maybe juniors in high school to sophomores in college, they'll come in and they'll say, "Man, I can't feel anything at all.
Yeah.
I'm like a
Yeah.
fucking robot." And
Yeah.
they're like, and my first question is, so how much stoicism have you been reading? And it's a ton of it, right?
Yeah.
And it connects to there's this great masculinity genders researcher, Ryan McKelly. I've mentioned him before on the podcast. He has a great TED talk where he talks about the pact with the devil, which is the idea that if you shut down kind of the negative emotions that men are not kind of socially supposed to display, it'll also shut down the other side of you, right? It'll kind of
Right.
shut down the positives. Brene Brown talks about this too. And so this pact with the devil leads them in a state of, you know, just, yeah, roboticism.
Yeah.
And I ultimately help them to understand this is not pure stoicism, right? I think
Yeah.
you've misappropriated what they were saying, but I'm just curious if you've come across that too. This misuse.
Not of people coming to me saying that they've kind of read too much stoicism or misapplied it, right? Because I think that is that you can use the stoicism and misapply it,
Absolutely.
but there is also a potential there to that it might be a pathway that they can really understand and they can feel really understood, but then they have to keep kind of diving into it in the right way, right? It's not just to read, you spend 3 months reading stoicism, you're like, now I got it, and I'm just going to apply this philosophy to the rest of my life. Maybe you don't fully understand it, right? Maybe you don't quite,
So
um,
true.
yeah. And so that's the difference between just to read Epic, because Epictetus was kind of the root of it, and then when Marcus is writing, he was reading a lot of Epictetus as he was writing his meditations. He was kind of reworking it in his mind, right? He said it's his private journal.
Sure.
That it's one thing to look at his Epictetus's handbook, which is kind of a lot of brief phrases, but when you look at the discourses, it's all about God. He uses the word God sometimes 5 times in a paragraph, right?
Right. It almost
And
sounds Christian.
yeah, right. Except for the parts when you figure out what he means by God, and that it's the same thing as the universe, right? But
Right.
otherwise, you can see why. And it's not so different from a lot of the things that people practically gain as benefits from their Christian faith, right? That it's a
Sure.
lot of stuff that's in there too. And I think it's maybe one way the Stoics make sense of it is this idea of the spirit versus the
Mm,
emotion. One of the phrases in DBT is trying to accept things with your mind, your body, and your spirit, right? So
interesting.
if your emotion is felt in your body, what is, and then your mind is your thoughts you're telling yourself, then what is the spirit? The way I just tell people, it's everything else, right? It's whatever else is left. And maybe a lot of that is your emotion, but the part that's not just your physical, like you said, you see a rattlesnake and your body is in fight or flight. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's really good. Okay, so what do you think about this? One of the things that comes up in this quote that I read that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted your thoughts on it, is when Marcus says, "For insofar as these qualities are more human, they are also more manly." I
Yeah.
think that's a pretty pregnant indictment against a toxic masculinity. But I'm curious if you see it that way and
Oh,
what
yeah.
you get out of that.
That Seneca has a bit of a reading on is called On Anger or De Ira,
Yeah.
and that he talks about what do we do with our anger, and that the Stoics were often kind of the teachers and the consultants to leaders and emperors. So it's this idea, right? Should you be up there, your face is red and you're screaming? And actually, as I'm saying, it brings to mind like Adolf Hitler. If you saw any of his speeches he gave to
Oh
people,
yeah.
he thought that anger would impress people and be really, make him seem great, right, and persuasive. But you know, to be calm, people might think you're low energy, but when you see a certain type of calmness and this, certainty that comes with it, right? This security
Mm,
there. That, but in any case, why I bring up Seneca, one of the things he says about, I think it's even within that one, he says about justice, the virtue of justice for the Stoics is willing other people towards virtue. And I've actually taken that as being like, what is it to love other people? You want to
mm,
see them do better, right? And it is, as I've talked with some kind of Stoic scholars, current like researchers, that question of what do Stoics have to say about love? Is that a pathological emotion, or is that actually like the most essential aspect of the spirit and things like that?
sure.
It's a hard question. It goes to how do you define any of these things? But
It's a really hard question, but an important
yeah,
one.
yeah,
I guess one of the things that kind of speaks out to me about his phrase there is that he's saying that to be able to manage one's emotions is not necessarily a manly thing, it's a human thing.
yeah,
And
yeah,
because I guess I can get kind of frustrated sometimes in circles that I belong to that reflect on masculinity, that somehow these are purely masculine traits that we need to
yeah.
embody. Where I think Marcus would say, no, these are human traits
This is
that
where
we
I'll
need to
kind of
think
go.
about.
Yeah, I'll go back to, and one thing as he's saying they're human traits, it's also this idea of they're divine traits. They're what make us
Mm,
human as separate from animals. We have this spark of divinity in us, right? So to be compassionate, to be kind towards others, to not just be strong, angry, and destroy them, right, is
yeah.
fits with all the Christian ideas of God too, right?
Mm,
And so I'll kind of bring in the Jungian things of what helped me to kind of answer this is
sure.
the idea of the king archetype. And this was my response to the whole post on toxic masculinity,
Okay.
was that idea, do we need, this toxic masculinity, this masculinity stuff is bad. If if what you're meaning is and this is from Robert Moore's definition, right, that patriarchy is insecure masculinity. It's the masculinity that's constantly grasping for power because it feels unpowerful. It doesn't have
Mm,
enough power. It doesn't feel secure in itself. So it's trying to do everything to prove it has power and take power over other people so that no one can ever see that you're vulnerable. That the alternative to patriarchy then would be secure masculinity, right? This would be the idea you need more of the masculinity that is, and then these archetypes of the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And the idea is, what is a real warrior that's not a sadist would be a warrior that follows the king, that understands God, basically, right? So if you can
mm,
get power from somewhere else, you're not feeling so insecure that you can never be vulnerable, you can never trust anybody. Um, but then what kind of gives you that power? What is it you need to be? That ego self-axis kind of idea
mm.
again. How do you stay connected with it, but not so full of yourself that you think you are, this all of this power?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. No, really well
Yeah.
said. I think about, and man, I'm forgetting his name, but this was a psychologist in Mexico that was accessing Freud's work early on,
Yeah,
and he ended up reflecting on something called machismo, which is like
yeah.
the Latin American version of toxic masculinity.
Oh yeah,
And it doesn't seem that profound now, but it was, I think, at the time. He argued that machismo is basically compensatory for a deep
yeah,
insecurity.
yeah.
I think it's exactly what you were saying, that
That
patriarchy.
I'm out here in New Mexico where machismo is a big thing, and I never thought that machismo is the same as toxic masculinity. But I'm gonna have to give that some thought. Yeah,
Man, and I've heard it said, yeah, that it could be almost toxic masculinity on steroids. And I'm gonna say that I'm actually originally from Puerto Rico.
yeah,
I'm mixed, I'm half, and so growing up with that, yeah, I was well aware of toxic masculinity before I knew what that concept meant.
right. Yeah, and that idea that right, you're supposed to strut around and everybody look at me and look how big my car is and all of these things.
Exactly, exactly.
When to just be happy with who you are, right? That you don't need to try to be something else, try to prove. Why do you need to prove anything to anyone? Why does it matter what they think, right?
Mm,
These are the good things from Stoicism. That
yes.
yeah, don't be worried about what everybody else thinks. Do what it is that you need to do that feels right in the moment, right?
Mm,
And then that's a very hard thing to do, right? To go against peer pressure, to go against all kinds of things. But that's
sure,
quite courageous, right?
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, David, do you have time for me to kind of ask you another question that I want your help kind of figuring out? I
I
don't know
do.
if
I
we'll
got a little bit of
solve.
time.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So this is a big one for me. But let me just kind of set up the context a little bit. In my understanding of psychology and the schools of thought that have really inspired me even lately, they're very relational.
Yeah.
They're governed by ideas that the human person grows and develops not in isolation or by
Yeah.
themselves, but in the context of kind of mutual vulnerable relationships.
Yeah.
And if you start to think about that, you begin to realize certain forms of unhealthy or rigid or toxic masculinity are about kind of isolation, right? Because
Yeah.
if you depend on someone, or if you're interdependent, you're seen as kind of
Right.
weak, and so
Right.
it's going to kind of breed this isolation. So it's kind of trying to counter some of that. Now, I am not saying that Marcus or Stoicism sort of breeds a self-reliance kind of attitude, or kind of results in isolation, but I think there's kind of a tension there.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping maybe you can kind of talk to that. And I guess I want to read something from Donald Robertson to kind of set it up, and then maybe you can respond. He says, elsewhere, Marcus affirms his desire to live up to Antonius's example and become one who is manly and mature, a statesman, a Roman, and a ruler. To him, this means being able to perform his duties and even face death in good cheer without being dependent upon the support from others. He sums it up in the maxim, you must stand upright, not be held upright. Upright and not righted by others is kind of another way to put it. So I sense kind of this tension
Yeah.
in Stoicism and kind of this modern psychotherapeutic emphasis on embodiment and relationality, community. What do you make of that tension?
It makes me think of several things, but one is actually the idea like codependence, right? Because to be independent is great. And he said we need to interdepend on people. You don't want to become dependent, right? Where you depend on people and you can't do this for yourself. You need someone else to do it for you. That's
100%.
ideal as much as we can. Maybe there's, if you're disabled or there's places where we do truly depend
Sure, sure.
sometimes, but that, and then similarly to depending on somebody though, related word, to be dependable, right? You want to be dependable, that other people can depend on you, yet not become dependent on you, right? So that's, as you said, yeah, why relationships are so meaningful. It's this constant struggle to constantly confront yourself with all these things. That so that the Stoics, it does teach a lot of that independence and self-reliance, but it is always for the purpose of giving back and finding what is your duty, what is your role in society. And your role, it doesn't need to be an emperor, right? You have to look at yourself and see what's appropriate for you. Where is it that you fit in? So for myself, right, that I'm a therapist, but before that I knew, and that's what I do now, so that's what I should focus on doing, right? But before that I was a pretty good listener, right? So that's why I'm like, well, what are things where me being a good listener helps? And maybe it could have been in managing people, maybe it could have been something else, right?
Sure.
But So that, and that's the idea with Stoicism. Yeah, if you just read any one piece, maybe it is giving you a certain kind of way of looking at things, but to make sure you keep your mind open to, the parts that talk about the cosmopolis, right? And that what is justice is really about others. The virtue of justice is all about other people. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think there's a stream within Marcus. I really see it in his meditations. I think more so than any other Stoic. He talks about, being a citizen of the world, being
Yeah.
cosmopolitan. He talks about, if you harm others, you're harming yourself. Like
Yeah.
that we are kind of organically, intimately connected to everyone and to all things. I think there are some resources in there to maybe develop kind of an interdependent approach rather
Yeah.
than just kind of a pure like self-reliance kind of thing.
Yeah.
But again, if that's what he's ultimately teaching, I mean, I can have space for that. I would probably disagree, but I'm just curious if we can kind of reframe it a little bit.
No, and another way to think of it, this sort of goes to my thoughts on, sort of the Jungian individuation and the hero's journey,
Individuation.
right?
Yes.
But that part of it is sometimes to pull away, right? It's to go out in the wilderness, to be a monk and go to the monastery, to withdraw and with your books, and you are just working on yourself. But then it is always for that purpose of you bring, whatever you found in the dungeon in the underworld back to the village, and you bring it back, and now you're stronger, and now people can lean on you a little bit. They can actually rely on you for something. Um,
Yeah.
so
Man,
there's
that,
back and forth.
David, that's beautiful. I remember, damn it, I don't know where it comes from. My therapist in his office had, all the collected work. So he pulled out this
Yeah,
one book one time and kind of read this passage because I was wrestling with this idea. And it's Jung basically saying that yes, you individuate, and at one level you're called to kind of leave and right, go your own path, connect with your inner authority, but there's a return where you bring some of those values back to the collective. It's
yeah,
at some level to almost bless the community, right? Or to
yeah.
kind of impact someone else. So
So
I
that's the
think
archetype, just as you said there, the archetype of the true king.
mm,
The two things that the king does is he provides order and he blesses. So that for sometimes providing order can feel too oppressive to other people. But if there's no
sure.
order, people don't care for that either, right? And then that idea of blessing, right? It's a father that looks at their child a certain way, and then that kid feels seen, right? Or it's similar to feeling heard, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so that the king is not about I'm the boss and everyone does what I say and bring me all your money and look at me how great I am, right? That's the tyrant. That's the immature masculine, rather
Right.
than the mature masculine. Because actually, the king has to sacrifice a lot. He can't do whatever he wants. He needs to be a example for everything, But that's the purpose of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, David, before we sign off, I mean,
Yeah.
is there anything else that you would want to say about any of these very rich and complicated subjects that we've been exploring? I mean, I know I've benefited quite a bit. You've helped me to see things differently. Very grateful for our time. Yeah, do you have any kind of final words?
I'm trying to think somewhere to wrap up your question about the young men who feel like robots and can't feel, right? And
Yeah,
that's from my DBT perspective, that's reasonable mind, right? That's you've said the emotions are not important, right? And to see what actually is important within them, because the other thing that's present in emotion mind are your values. There's no rational reason for why your values need to be this or that.
yeah,
You know it because you feel something within you, right? And that's when you read the Stoicism, you read about the virtues, and you see which of these values really feel right, right? That there is a role for some kind of feeling, and even if feeling is the wrong word, right? If the Stoics see it more as a spirit, that's
right.
one way to say it. Yeah,
No, absolutely. And I want to be clear that yeah, ultimately with these guys, I'm gently helping them to see that they've misappropriated
yeah,
stoicism because I think
yeah,
there's a lot of just popular and I'm not against that, but there's little snippets, little quotes here and there. That's why
yeah,
I love what you're doing, the ad fontes approach, going back to kind of traditional stoicism,
yeah,
reading the sources. That's where it's at, I think. I basically tell them, look, they weren't against emotions or even feeling emotions. It's what you said.
yeah,
It's don't be caught in the passions where they're completely
yeah,
controlling your life. It's actually important to feel the emotions, right? To let
yeah,
them pass through. It's just, are you going to link them up with all these cognitions and all these narratives and stories about what they mean and what it
yeah,
now, says about your identity, that's where we need to do the work together. But to feel, grief or sadness or fear, it's human to do
And
so.
then that it's so scary to do so, right? To start feeling them when you haven't felt them. That's very scary. But that's what the courage is. It's only courage if you feel afraid first. If you didn't feel afraid first, it's just reckless, right? If you just go running through all the rattlesnakes and you didn't care at all, right?
Right.
But the courage to that this is going to be really hard and this is really scary, and now I have a challenge. And that's, yeah, if I don't know what to do, then to seek someone with some wisdom, right? Somebody that you can respect, and that's the way. Yeah.
Yeah. So David, if anyone wants to connect with you and just find out more about you, maybe listen to your podcast, how do they find out about you? Where do they go online to connect with you?
I got a website, prosokproject.com, and that kind of links to all my different places. And so
Okay.
you can
I'll,
find me
I'll
on
include that
Twitter.
in the show notes.
Yeah, is Prosoche. It's the Greek word for mindfulness, or the Stoic mindfulness, basically, is why I really like that idea.
Yeah.
Because to be mindful is to be conscious, and that relates to the idea of, if you're not being mindful, you're unconscious. So somewhere in there, the Stoics get this idea of unconscious, but they don't use quite that word, right? When you're on
Sure.
autopilot, when you're not
Sure.
being a thoughtful, rational human being. But so yeah, on Twitter, if you send me a private message, I try to check those and respond to that. Yeah.
Okay. And then Between Two Ravens is the podcast
And that's the podcast on Norse mythology, and
on
we have
Norse
another
mythology.
Twitter there too. So you can message me on either one of those about the Norse mythology too. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So David, would you mind just ending with what's the line of the podcast, which kind of just carries the spirit of what I'm trying to do by just saying the words, continue the conversation?
Yeah. Continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I hope we do continue this conversation. I think that'd be great.
I do too, David. Yeah, this was awesome.